Did you just say I was on, Greg? Right. Well, hello everyone. This is definitely the smallest audience I've had in a while, honestly. But I'm told that it's live streamed. So for those of you at the front, yeah, you just turn around a little bit and wave at the internet behind you. Yeah, so, I mean, I'm told it's live streamed and maybe on social media it's like spreading around and people are listening. I don't know. It hardly seems worth using a microphone, but I suppose the internet needs the microphone, doesn't it? Anyway, I'll introduce myself. I'm Neil Woods, and I'm the chairman of LEAP UK. LEAP are an international group of law enforcement figures who now campaign to end the drug war. We campaign for the full regulation of all drugs. Now, it was a bit busier than this yesterday afternoon. We've got a booth. Don't know why I'm pointing to the internet over there, but we've got a booth over there. And lots of people came to speak to us yesterday. And I was quite surprised with how many people who would say, yay, yeah, legalise cannabis. We need to legalise cannabis, but not those other drugs. Not those other awful drugs that do people harm. Well, I was quite surprised to be debating that with people yesterday, because actually, as police officers and other people who are involved in law enforcement, we've seen the devastation caused by the drug war for all drugs. And actually, I would call me controversial, but I would start with heroin way before I would legalise cannabis, because at least cannabis isn't causing overdoses, is it? But now with the heroin market and fentanyl creeping into the UK, that is urgent because people are dying. It's urgent for cocaine because cocaine deaths are up 8% in the last 12 months because cocaine has got more stuff added to it and it's got much higher purity. So it's actually more urgent to legalise cocaine because people are dying of it. So those are the kind of debates I had yesterday. I was very surprised to have them because obviously there's quite a few people attending this event who likes cannabis. Go on, hands up. I'm allowed to put my hand up. Put your hands up if you actually enjoy cannabis. Yeah, this is for people in the internet. Put your hands up. I'll feel it, honestly. But we shouldn't be just talking about our drug of choice. We shouldn't be just campaigning for that. We should be campaigning to end the drug war and take the power away from organised crime. And I'll tell you a story about one of the reasons why we should end the power of organised crime. I did an undercover operation, because that's what I used to do. Did I say that? Did I say I was an undercover cop? Right, I used to work undercover, and for 14 years, in fact. And I did an operation in Nottingham where I'd spent about 4.5 months trying to get an introduction into this particular group of people, this particular cartel. And it's a cartel organised by a guy called Colin Gunn. You may have heard of him. You can look him up on the internet. Fairly psychotic figure. And at the time of the operation, he was at war with another cartel. And there were daily shootings in Nottingham. Well, that's one reason we need to get rid of organised crime, because brewery bosses don't have shootouts, do they? You know, the legal market is not going to have firearms involved. But eventually, I manipulated this guy called Cammy into introducing me to one of the lieutenants of Colin Gunn. Now, I should tell you how I manipulated this guy, and because I think it's good to know what police tactics are used. So I picked my mark, this guy called Cammy, because he was a problematic heroin user and because they're the easiest people to manipulate. So I bought him gifts. I remember one day I gave him a baseball cap, and he took his baseball cap off, his old one, threw it in the bin, and he was so excited with this new cap. He looked at himself in reflection in the mirror in a shop window. He put this new cap on and he was so happy. He says, "Mate, thank you." When Cammy was arrested, because he was on bail for heroin dealing, and he was breaching his bail conditions in some of the ways that he was helping me. And so as a result of that, he got arrested as well. And when he was in the police cells, he was on suicide watch. Now, that's not because he was scared of going to prison or because he was withdrawing from heroin. He did go to prison for 3.5 years. But the reason he was on suicide watch is because he thought, and he told this to the police in the interview, he thought that I was his one friend in the world. Because I'd spent time with him, listening to his problems, getting to know him, and he just saw me as the only person he could trust. So I think it's worth as many people knowing as possible that undercover policing is the nuclear option of policing. It really is. You can't go into a community, you can't go into people's lives as an undercover cop without having a massive impact on those people. And Cammy actually being suicidal is one symptom of lots of carnage that undercover police work causes. But he did introduce me to the gangster that I wanted to get connected to. And when he did, this particular guy, he turned up in a car with his 12-year-old son next to him in the car. And it was quite bizarre because he looked exactly like his father. He'd got the skinhead, he was wearing the same outfit. It was like a mini-me. And with his 12-year-old son in the car, he interrogated me for about 10, 15 minutes. But while he did that, he had a knife pressed into my bollocks. Now, trust me, that's not something you want to experience. And it's quite unsettling. Even just as unsettling was the fact that his 12-year-old son was there as well. So he asked me questions for about 10, 15 minutes. Felt like hours. But eventually he decided to sell me some crack cocaine and some heroin. So I was in. It took me 4.5 months to get to that point, but then I was in. Now, the day after that, it was fairly tense at work, but two of my backup crew, because I sort of had a team, people who would take my exhibits off me, people who would be back up, sort of parked up on the edge of town, but the two backup people, they had gone off sick. And so two other people that I didn't know were brought in. And as I was introduced to them in the morning, one of them, I shook his hand, he was fine. The second one, the hairs went up on the back of my neck. Instinctively, I just knew there was something wrong with him. So I said to the boss, I said, look, I cannot have this guy knowing what I'm doing today. So he said, fine, we'll exclude them both. We won't tell them what you're doing. We won't have them in the briefing. We'll just exclude them. And it turns out that that was an instinct that quite possibly kept me alive, because 12 months later, when Colin Gunn was eventually brought down, it turned out that that guy that I'd been suspicious of was an employee of Colin Gunn. He was an employee of the gangster that I'd been trying to chase. And he'd been paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wage, plus bonuses for good information. He'd been paid as someone with no previous convictions, no suspicion, to join the police. And he'd been in the police for 7 years, but working for the gangsters. Now, I found this fairly shocking, especially as Colin Gunn had been letting everybody know that if he ever caught an undercover cop, he'd be tortured to death. You know, these are the kind of stakes that were going on. But all of the senior police that I discussed this with afterwards said to me, yeah, well, Woodsy, of course this goes on. Of course we have these spies in the ranks. Of course we have this level of corruption. Because with this much money involved, how can we not? It's obvious. Of course this goes on. So that's one of the things, wherever I do speaking events, that's one of the things I'm most enthusiastic to try and let people know, that people should realise the extent of the corruption that's been caused by the drug war. Because I should make something completely clear. quite often people will debate with me and say, but you can legalise drugs, but you won't get rid of organised crime. No, okay, there's organised crime for fraud. There's organised crime for smuggling booze. There's organised crime for all sorts of things. But I should make this very, very clear. The only thing that can pay for that kind of corruption, the only thing, is the illicit drug trade. You could not pay for that kind of corruption by smuggling booze or cigarettes or fraud. Because fraud, for example, it's lots of different people involved in it. And what policing does for drugs is that it concentrates the wealth into fewer and fewer hands. Because the police generally catch the low-hanging fruit. They don't catch the biggest fish most of the time. And actually, a lot of the organised crime groups will use informants to grass up other people and use the police to shut down the competition so that they get richer. And that concentrates the wealth into fewer and fewer hands. So over time, policing drugs monopolises the drugs market. And it makes it more violent as well, because the most successful gangsters are the ones who can most successfully intimidate a community. So it's policing drugs which are causing that. Because when I first started working undercover, it was easy. There was no threat. There was no threat of violence. But within 12 months, people go to prison, people talk to each other, and they start to develop the defence against police tactics. And there's no end to that. There's no chance of de-escalation. There's no peace treaty. It just keeps getting more violent. Now, I mentioned informants. There's something which I think this audience might find interesting about police informants. I speak a lot on it, and I debate a lot on informants on the TV and the radio. I get all sorts of invites to talk about it because people get really excited about informants. Only a few weeks ago, there was a big news story about an informant being used to bring down a child exploitation ring, a child grooming ring up in Newcastle. Some of you might remember the news story. And it was very controversial for people because the informant that was used had got a previous conviction for a child sexual offence. And people were outraged that this informant was paid £10,000. You know, the idea of paying a child rapist £10,000. Now, I took the view, and I still take the view, that actually that was money well spent. It might leave a bad taste in the mouth because you don't want to be giving money to someone like that. But that person was valuable because of his previous conviction. He was valuable because he could infiltrate those people. Only someone with that kind of background would have been able to find the information about those people. And 18 people were caught and lots of sexual offences were prevented. So it was worthwhile. Now, there might be people still disagree with me, I know, but the reason I'm telling you that is because earlier on this year there was a Freedom of Information request which found that £20 million had been paid to police informants in this country in the last 5 years. £20 million. But what any police officer who has ever had anything to do with informants will tell you is that at least 90% of informants' money goes for drugs offences. It would be great if it were paying money to investigate sexual offences, but we're not. I would say 95%. We've got another Leap speaker in the audience. Would you agree 95% to drugs offences from informants, do you reckon? Yeah. So 95%. So you think that's £20 million almost. That's an enormous amount of money. Now, last year I debated on the radio with a serving cop. And on that radio debate, he said he had paid one informant £14,000, 14,000, for information which led to a cannabis factory being shut down, raided. And he said that the money was worthwhile because the cannabis grow, according to police estimates, was worth £250,000, £250,000. So he thought that £14,000 as money well spent. Now, even if you agreed with the police figures of the value of it, and in my experience, police tend to grossly overestimate the value of a grow. That's an enormous amount of money wasted, because the week after that raid, or next week, or any time in the future, there will still be 2 cannabis grows in this country for every serving police officer. And as soon as one is shut down, another one is set up. I mean, does anyone here think that the price has ever changed for cannabis as a result of police action? Anyone? No? Has anyone struggled to... You reckon? Has anyone ever struggled to find cannabis as a result of a police raid? No? It's not really having much of an impact on the market, is it? And yet, £20 million are being spent to pay informants. Now, I would say that's not only an incredible waste of money, it's also completely immoral as well. People are being arrested, they're having the doors kicked in, they're being handcuffed behind, trussed up, face down, handcuffed behind the back, and someone's pocketed 14 grand to provide the information to do that. So I don't normally tell that informant story to audiences, but I thought it might be of interest to people here, because if you're advocating a regulated cannabis market and you want information and you want to argue that something is not right, then I think that more people should be complaining that the police are spending £20 million on informants, because that's a waste of money and it's only fueling the drug war. It's only adding to the monopolisation and the violence of organised crime. And I think more of us should be complaining about the use of police informants for drugs. I think it's a massive issue. It's not something that's talked about, really. And so that's one reason I raised this. Now, I know I'm meant to be on for half an hour, but people normally like to ask me questions. So has anyone got any questions? Because I think that's it. Greg, is that including questions? Maybe I should have paid the attention to the instructions, I don't know. Has anyone got a question for me? I'll come down and bring the microphone to you. Go on, ex-undercover cop, you can ask me anything you want. Hey, what?
Section 8 of the Human Rights Act, how does that apply? Because it says that forces should not be used into our homes unless there's a reason for it, a victim of a crime. If I'm growing weed at home to serve myself as a medical condition, who is the victim, and why can they still do that and stand it up in court, whereas the Human Rights Act 2010 state that they clearly cannot?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you on that there is a breach of the Human Rights Act. And in South Africa, for example, there is a constitutional court going on suggesting that it is against the human rights. So there could be a ruling from South Africa which actually agrees with what you say. That's the Dagger couple trial. So it's the second constitutional court about that. So because they have such a modern constitution, that may well be something which will spread across the world as an issue. And I completely agree with you. It is a clear breach of the Human Rights Act. And in terms of how things are in the UK, the person who decided how communities should be policed was Robert Peel. So we have the Peelian principles, and he said that the police should be the community and the community should be the police. But the Misuse of Drugs Act separates community and police, because that's somebody, like you say, somebody growing cannabis for themselves, for their own use in their own home. That's to go into that person's home and, again, truss them up and handcuff them. It's a complete breach of human rights. It's also a breach of the Peelian principles, and it's the principles that the idea of policing by consent is built upon. And we used to police by consent in this country until we had drug laws. That's put the complete breach between policing and community. So I totally agree, and it's shocking, and we should be complaining about it, and people should advocate to their MPs and complain about it. In fact, you're probably aware of this anyway, but I'll just tell you what happens in a briefing before a drugs warrant. Now, I was taught by my tutor to treat everyone with respect. And even for a robbery, which is a theft with violence from a shop, my tutor took me to a door and we knocked on the door politely. And we spoke to him and we asked him if he would invite us in, even though we had a warrant. And everything was done very civilized. And he was a very old-fashioned cop, was my tutor. I've even knocked on the door for child sexual offences because we know there's going to be no problem. There's no reason not to be polite. And that's the way we're meant to police. Now, in 1971, the police were given this set of powers for policing drugs. And they didn't really know what to do with them to start with. And they were policing like they used to do. They'd knock on the door. But what they quickly found is people with drugs would either flush them down the toilet or they would swallow them, and then they've got an overdose. So procedures had to develop to deal with that, especially as if you bash the door in and you don't find any drugs, the police have to pay for the damage. So they really don't want you to flush it down the toilet. But also, they don't want the complaints and the problems, and they don't want people dying. So that's why the tactics were developed to rush in and stop someone overdosing and stop someone flushing down the toilet. So, in a briefing, and this will be happening all over the country now, you'll have a sergeant who'll brief their team, and she or he will say, we'll have someone in body armour with the door key, which is the big red hammer. We'll have 2 people by the side to rush in, and then the rest of the team afterwards. You'll have designated teams in the house. You'll have a map of the house or wherever it is, and people will be designated a room. And the sergeant will say to those troops, get in there as fast as you can, shouting, screaming, and cause some fear. Those words are used in a briefing, cause some fear. Cause some fear to disorientate people so that they are slow to react and you can get them trussed up and handcuffed behind their back before they've got the chance to do anything. So that's an instruction to be aggressive, and that would be going on every day at a drugs warrant somewhere in this country. So you've got the situation where police are smashing someone's door in, shouting and screaming, maybe not screaming, but shouting, to intimidate someone so that they don't move quickly, so that we can protect them from themselves. I mean, I suspect I'm preaching to the converted anyway, but when you actually put it in those terms, that's how insane this whole situation is. Whereas before the Misuse of Drugs Act, we've been knocking on the door politely. So yeah, that's a breach of human rights, I would say. So hang on.
See, with the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, it's not a misuse of drugs to use it for a medical condition. So they're actually in breach of 2 laws there doing it, but they can still continue to keep doing it and prosecute.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it would take a very good lawyer, though, to take that through the British courts, I'm afraid.
I recently did a Freedom of Information request for information regarding the cost of policing cannabis. And I contacted all the police forces in the UK to do this, and every single one sent back information that said that cannabis crimes are not separated under Section 6 of the Misuse of Drugs Act. They're brought into line with all the other crimes, drug crimes, so it's very hard to research to find out what was the cost for, say, crack cocaine policing against cannabis policing. Can you tell me why that might be?
Yeah, it's just that the police are not actually that good at keeping records and separating different types of crimes. So for a policing point of view, that all the kind of categorising they will do will be for drugs offences. And some police areas are actually not even so good at separating things like the difference between possession with intent to supply and things like that. Some of them are not even that good for that. But I do know that there's a Freedom of Information Act request for the overall cost of policing drugs as a whole, went in a few years ago to the Home Office, and they actually produced a figure of £7 billion a year for the whole of drugs policing, which actually makes it the single biggest policing bill There is more spent on policing drugs than child sexual exploitation or burglaries or robberies or of anything. It's the biggest bill. We spend more on it than anything, which again, it's baffling, really. £7 billion a year. And the value of the market, the black market of drugs in this country, according to the most recent estimate by the National Crime Agency, is £10.7 billion. £10.7 billion of profit into the hands of organised crime. That's just the UK. That's the UK alone, yeah, 10.7 billion. And the National Crime Agency have published those figures. And the NCA even admit and even concede lots of the things that we say at Leap UK. For example, that policing drugs is making monopolies of organised crime. For example, in the strategic assessment published by them in 2016, they conceded that the organised crime groups from the big cities are now moving into and taking over the drug supply in the county towns and seaside towns. Now, that's been happening for a while. I saw that when I was working undercover. But the National Crime Agency have published that as a public document. They're acknowledging that over time, not only are they not having any impact on the drug supply at all, but the monopolies are growing. It creates a situation that, say you live in, I don't know, Leamington Spa or something, and the local police do a successful series of warrants for heroin. Say there's 2 or 3 houses shut down where they've been dealing heroin. That's the worst possible thing that could happen for Leamington Spa. Because if they were local dealers, the people that's going to come in and fill the gap, they're going to be from Birmingham. And trust me, some of the gangsters from Birmingham I met are seriously unpleasant. But that's what's happening all around the country. Where police try hard, it's the low-hanging fruit that they catch. And so the market becomes more violent. Is there any other questions?
Do the drugs help you get into character?
Do the drugs help me get into character? Thankfully, I didn't have to take drugs very often. I mean, obviously, I had to use cannabis occasionally, but that's just cannabis, isn't it? I never had to try heroin. Thankfully, that would be terrifying. Never had to try crack. I once made a very stupid mistake, actually, and I was infiltrating this pub in Leicester. I was arranging to buy stolen cars and cocaine and all sorts of stuff, but I made myself out to be a connoisseur of amphetamine. It was just something to talk about, and I'm clearly not. But this particular guy who I'd just seen order someone get beaten up for a £10 debt, I'd just seen him do that, and suddenly he comes to me. I've been known him for a few weeks by this stage, and he holds this bag up, and he says, "There you go, I've got a present for you." And in this bag, there was this sort of pink, toxic-looking goo. It smelt like the urine from a glue-sniffing cat. You could almost see it dissolving the bag before my eyes. And I thought, oh, shit. So he said, "Go on, try some then." And he was obviously dead excited. He's thinking I'm going to be dead impressed with this. He's brought me a present. So I opened up this bag and I got a little bit on my finger and put it in my mouth. I could feel it dissolving my tongue instantly. And he says, "No, you want more than that." So I took another big load. And I think the mouth ulcer was there for about 2 months. Anyway, eventually it hit my belly, and I was a complete mess in about 15 minutes. It was horrendous. I was so high. It was like pure anxiety. I had to get out of there quick. I had to be driven home, and it was a nightmare. I didn't sleep properly for 3 nights. It was horrendous. Mind you, my house has never been so tidy. Yes, so, sorry, in answer to your question, yeah, on that occasion, drugs definitely helped me get into character, yeah, definitely. But, yeah. Is it like acting? Is it like acting? It's not really, because if you try and act, then you have to try and remember who you're pretending to be. It's like a very good level 1 undercover cop once said to me, "Remember, you're not an actor. You're just playing a different version of yourself." Which, when I say that to journalists, they love it because they can write a sort of psychological angle on it or something. But it's true. You still have to be who you are, but you just have to be as humble as possible. I think that's the secret to undercover work, being humble. Is there any other questions? Yes.
You're an ex-undercover cop. How do your words resonate with your ex-colleagues? And second question, I work in hydroponics. What's the chances of me being infiltrated, and how will I know if it's an ex-copper walking through the door?
Yeah, my colleagues, when I stopped in the job, I was public enemy number one. When I first spoke out and did an article in Vice, I had a close friend in the police who was called into a senior officer's office and said, right, you are receiving a lawful order to have no more contact at all with Neil Woods. You must delete him from social media now, delete him from your phone. So yeah, I was ostracised. But since I brought the book out, it's available on Amazon or any good bookseller, Good Cop, Bad War. Since I've brought that out, I've had loads and loads of support from serving police, and it's really good. But as for hydroponics and infiltrating, well, there's another ex-undercover cop sat there, and we've discussed this, and we don't think that's Andrew Ward, a new member of Leap UK. We were never sent into anything for cannabis because it was never seen as worthwhile. We only ever did crack cocaine, heroin, those kind of things. I personally find it very, very unlikely that any resources would be put into cannabis at all. Having said that, I am aware of a grow shop that did have an undercover cop sent in, and they got evidence of conspiracy against the people selling by drawing them into a conversation which led them to suggest that they were advocating the use of that equipment for growing cannabis. Now, I think that nowadays those kind of resources wouldn't be used very often, but what I would say is if customers start asking advice, just be careful what you say, always. And undercover cops are always going to try harder to get a short conversation into a short piece of time. And I'm sorry, I've just been given the 2-minute warning, so I'm just going to give a close, but ask me afterwards. So yeah, I'm going to conclude now by saying, please support Leap UK on all social media. Spread the word, word about the book. Please listen to the podcast. If you don't know about the podcast, come and see us on the booth over there. We'll give you a flyer for it. The podcasts are amazing, and they are actually the social movement caused by the podcast is huge because we're reaching audiences that wouldn't normally listen to this kind of stuff, and we're persuading new people. So please support it, and thank you very much for listening to me today.